Hello, guys. It's Adina, and we are actually on break from the Atheist in Recovery podcast. But I thought it would be fun to share some of my most popular episodes as well as my favorite episodes from year one. For me, listening to some of these old episodes, I always pick up something new and learn something in addition to what I thought I already learned from the guests. And if it's a book review, I love going through a book and reviewing the pages upon pages of highlights and sussing out my favorite ideas that I feel are worth sharing. So before you go, don't forget to sign up for the weekly newsletter where we talk about learning to identify patterns of dysfunctional thinking, changing the dysfunctional thinking into something more positive, and I throw in a little homework for good measure, and you can find the link to sign up for the newsletter in the show notes. Okay, guys, I hope you enjoy this Encore episode.
Welcome to the Atheist in Recovery podcast, where we talk about finding hope in recovery. And now your host, Dr. Adina Silvestri.
Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to episode 8 of the Atheists in Recovery podcast. I am excited for you to meet my next guest, Dr. Elizabeth Bonet. And for today's episode, it was pretty enlightening. We talked about Dr. Bonet and her journey through recovery, how she started as a preacher's kid, a PK, as she calls herself, and went throughout many years as a atheist, and then shuffled on into the spiritual world where she currently resides. And we talk about her journey and how identifying your higher power is incredibly important. And it really informs all of your recovery. And so we look at that. We look at, what it means to have a critical higher power and how to turn your feelings over when you're struggling with thoughts of relapse. And that religion, as you may have already figured out, it's not so black and white. You can be an atheist and still pray to God. So let's talk a little bit more about our guest, Dr. Bonet. She is a winner of numerous awards, including the Top 100 Moms in Business. Dr. Bonet has almost always worked for herself in one business or another, whether it was selling door-to-door at the age of 6, programming and designing websites, freelance writing, yoga, or hypnosis. She sold her award-winning business, Yoga Fairy Prenatal Yoga, in 2016 to concentrate on her private practice that provides hypnotherapy and hypnosis to people wanting a fast, easy way to transform. Dr. Bonet launched the podcast Hypnotize Me in December of 2016. It's currently in its 3rd season, has over 160,000 downloads, and is listened to in over 140 counties. Hypnotize Me is about hypnosis, transformation, and healing. She records her podcast from her loft in South Florida along with her dog, cat, husband, and 2 kids, who she asks to be quiet for just the half hour, please. And for our listeners, Dr. Bonet has a free hypnosis file that you can get by listening to her podcast or joining her newsletter. You can text the word hypnotize to 444-999 to join or visit her website. She also has a free meditation on Insight Timer, the #1 meditation app in the U.S. And if that was not impressive enough, she has written 3 books, one of which is on Amazon. Book #1, There Goes the Brainstem, Tales from the Trenches of Early Motherhood, Birth Stories from the Yoga Fairy, Real Tales of Birth from the Yoga Fairy Mamas, and Your Marriage Can Change Overnight. Okay, let's get started. Dr. Elizabeth Bonet, welcome to the show.
Hi, I'm happy to be here.
So I want to start our conversation today by inquiring about your spiritual background from childhood. Let's go back to the beginning.
Okay, we're going to go to the beginning. All right. Wonderful. So I was raised in a very religious household. So my dad was a minister, Methodist minister, and both my parents were very involved in the church. And then my mom was like a national level speaker to UMW, which is United Methodist Women. And then after my dad died, he died when I was about 18. My mom actually became a minister herself, ordained. Okay, so she already had a master's degree, but she went back to school to get a master's and then eventually a doctorate in divinity to become ordained herself. And then she traveled the world, um, yeah, doing ministry type of stuff. Now they actually did that together when I was younger. So I am the youngest of four, and they lived in Central Africa, Zaire, Zambia, for a decade. Okay, but there's about 9 years between my brother and myself, and so he was hitting his teen years, and I was itsy bitsy, and they decided to come back to the U.S. until basically all the kids were out of school. So he died my senior year of high school when they were getting their passports together and getting ready to go back through the Methodist Church again when he passed away. So my mother went on this journey and became ordained herself and tried to be in churches I grew up in Texas, so in the Dallas area, in Plano, outside of Dallas. So she tried to be in the U.S. churches, but it just didn't work for her. She felt like there was so much sexism going on as a female minister. So she decided to go abroad again. So she went to Nepal for about 5 years and then South Korea for, I don't know, about 7 years. And she would come home in between, for a little bit. She'd help take care of my nephew for a little while, that type of thing. So I grew up in an extremely religious household. I cannot remember even one time seeing my parents drink. They never did drugs. Yeah, it was prayer at dinner, church on Sunday, youth group Sunday night. Right? Yes.
Yeah, that's
yes.
so interesting. I definitely think that, you could have this formative background or milieu of identity and that kind of cultivates that support and belonging, but also it can cultivate a sense of loss. And so how has that changed for you throughout the years?
Well, when I went into college, I began questioning, and my mother was really convinced it was about grief. Like my dad had passed away and I was angry at God and all of this stuff. But I honestly didn't feel like it was about grief. I had begun questioning in my teens, but that's pretty typical, right? But it's also pretty hard to do as like a PK, a preacher's kid. Okay, because you are expected to really believe in God, right? Train up a child in the ways of the Lord. And I don't remember the second half, but they will eventually come back to it, right? So as I went through my college years and then into grad school, I really became an atheist. I felt like I didn't believe in God, not an agnostic, although a couple of my friends will argue that I was agnostic, because I did have this belief that there are things beyond our knowledge. Okay, so it wasn't a patriarchal God. I didn't believe in God anymore, or Jesus. I mean, Jesus is a historical figure, yes, but not as a religious figure for me. But on the other hand, I was going to church youth group because that was a good place to make friends at college, right? And have support. And they fed you on Sunday nights when the dorms were closed, the cafeteria, So they fed you on Sunday night. And I met my boyfriend through the church youth group in college, like all this stuff. But I continued to question. And by the time I graduated college, I was pretty much identifying as atheist because I really didn't believe in the patriarchal God I grew up with. Now, some freaky stuff had happened after my dad died to where I felt like there were things beyond us we didn't really understand. But I did not have the belief that that was the patriarchal God. Okay. And I was always fascinated by reading about near-death experiences. And so for me, I still read them. I still recommend them to clients. I work with anxiety. I'm an anxiety specialist. And I still recommend them if they're open to them. Like, for me, it's almost impossible to not feel better without reading near-death experiences, because they all come back and they're all like, we have a meaning here on this planet, like they're filled with a sense of meaning. They often change their life in significant ways. They don't. The ones I've read don't often identify a God per se, as in terms of a religious God that many of our religions are putting forth. More just a sense of being filled with profound love and spirituality. So I continued to read those even through my atheist years, I would say. And I met my ex-husband in graduate school. He wasn't in grad school, but I was in grad school during those years. And he was atheist. So for a good solid 20 years, I would say, I was atheist. I raised my children atheists, pretty much. I mean, I grew up with childhood songs that were religious, right? So I would wake them up with those. I would change the words. But, it was just sort of this sense, like that Rise and Shine song. I don't know if you know it. We were singing it the other day in the kitchen with my daughter. She had some friends over, some of her friends, and she's the only one who didn't really know the words. All her friends did because they've been to church, right? But it's like rise and shine and give God the glory, glory. Except I would change it to like give the earth the glory, glory,
Okay.
just to like get them up. So it was sort of this mixture. Yeah, it was this mixture because the songs were what I knew about mothering, but also they did give me comfort. So
Love that.
yeah, and my second child went to a Jewish preschool because it was one of the best ones around. And I loved their philosophy, of their preschool philosophy of it was more nurturing and creative, and it wasn't homework driven, which is just sort of crazy that some preschools are homework driven.
Yes.
But
yeah,
they weren't. So they're all about play and learning through play. So she would come home, and really she had a more of a religious base than my other daughter, who never went to preschool. I stayed home with her during those years. I was still staying at home with my second, but I had decided that I really didn't want to be insane, so I sent her to preschool, right? So we would have conversations about this sometimes, and she now identifies as atheist, but in the back of my mind, I'm like, well, she has a base in spirituality is how I see it, like very early learning base in spirituality. And my other daughter, well, I'm skipping ahead. So let me go back. I almost feel like, the attachment interviews where they ask you to tell about your childhood, and how somebody tells about their childhood is really important, more so than even what they're saying. And so sometimes when I talk about my childhood, that stuff comes up. I'm like, oh my God, I've transferred from the past to the present all of a sudden. It's like, I did not have a secure attachment to my narcissistic
Everything's
mother.
coming out live. Only just you and I.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Right. The thousands of people eventually listen to this. So, so I would say 20 years I was atheist. And then in there, I got divorced. And at some point after divorce, I started looking at various recovery programs. So I've never been addicted to alcohol or drugs, but I had other stuff going on. Overeating, under-earning, definitely some love addiction, I would say. So I began attending these groups, walking in as an atheist, and not even really realizing that this is a spiritual program. I mean, they say it in the steps, right? They say They do, but I had no idea. I didn't even really realize for a couple of months. Like, I think I just blocked it out. But, they would stand around at the end
Yeah.
and often hold hands and say the serenity prayer. And I just thought, well, God, I'll just ignore that part, basically. And also my home group that I identified with the most
Mm.
had a couple of atheists in it. So that group, by chance, tended to be very supportive of truly the concept of finding your own higher power instead of really calling that God. So I think I got lucky in that. I know other people have not had that experience when they walked into 12-step, and that they couldn't take the religion, and that really varies
heard that.
also from group to group and sometimes program to program. So as I began to work the steps and be more involved in that community, I would say it took about a year or so, but then I began to develop my own sense of what my higher power is. And I always say it's a freaky deaky, my woo-woo freaky deaky
Well, now you have to
higher
explain
power.
that.
Okay? Because yes. Well, it was not the patriarchal God of my childhood. Okay, absolutely not. It was more this like Indian goddess kind of image, somewhat like Lakshmi. And I saw her as loving and kind and really there to help me. So that's who I began to picture or image when I would pray. And I would do a lot of praying during those years. Now, I do have to say that even when I was an atheist, as a mother, I would often
Wow,
pray.
that's so interesting. You're not the first person to say that, especially as a mother, that phrase right there.
Yes, I would get so frustrated and overwhelmed, and I had severe PPD with both of them. And those toddler years were really hard for me. And so I would find myself being like, oh my God, like, please, somebody help me. I don't know who's up there, but please, somebody help me. It was a definite prayer. So definitely in the recovery years, I began to pray all the time, though. And when I remember walking in, when people say they would pray all the time, I'd be like, oh my God, I just roll my eyes, like that's nuts. That's just nuts. But as I began to find my own sense of spirituality, that did become a daily reality for me of like, okay, if nothing else, I still do this gratefulness of like something really wonderful happens, or I'm just walking the dog, I'm walking along and looking at the beautiful trees and say, thank you so much. I'm so grateful for these wonderful trees. And it's more like a heartfelt prayer to the universe than any particular, one deity, I would say. So my concept of my freaky deaky woo woo higher power also changed, I would say, in the last year or two. So that became more of a sense of, you may have to edit this very long pause out, or you can keep it in. It's up to you. Yes, for drama. But it became more of a sense that there are spirits that help us. There is an afterlife. Okay, so I always believed in reincarnation, but I couldn't figure out like this whole timeline in my head. Okay, like I had dated this guy right after my divorce. Well, I didn't date for like a year after my divorce because I was still nursing. But once the nursing was done, okay, I decided to date again. And this guy had a brain tumor like my father did. And there was just so many similarities there. But he would have been born before my father died. So I couldn't work it out in my mind. And then I got trained in hypnosis about 5 years ago, maybe 6 by now. And when you step into the hypnosis world, there's the clinical side of hypnosis, which helps all kinds of problems. And there's all kinds of medical research that goes on for those. problems in the hypnosis and how it works. But there's also the spiritual side of hypnosis that is pretty strong, where people are looking for answers from their childhood. They're looking for past life regressions, and then also sometimes going to some kind of spiritual place. So somebody recommended this book to me, and I began to read about this, and then it began to pop up in my sessions regardless of whether I wanted it to or not, regardless of whether I believed in it. In fact, 3 or 4 years ago, I would have told you I didn't believe in it. But actually, that's not true, because I had a past life regression myself, and that was probably 2013. And what are we in now? 2019? Yeah. Well, that's about 5 years ago, right? I'm so bad at math. Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, 5 or 6 years ago. Okay. So I had a past life regression myself, but I did not enjoy it. I did not like it. I did find some answers through it, though. But I was not doing it myself. So, because it's somewhat of a specialty area in hypnosis. But my clients begin to go there without prompting. And so I was like, okay, maybe there's something to this. And then I ran across this book that talked about this spiritual place in between lives, and that we send part of our energy stays in that spiritual place to continue learning, and we send part of our energy back into somebody, like a body we pick. Okay. So finally that made sense to me. I was like, oh, this is how those timelines work. Because people will say, like, if our children picked us, like, how does that work if we weren't even born yet? You know what I'm saying? Like, how did they decide to have a relationship with us? I don't know. It just gets sort of freaky, right? But at the same time, I'd had some experiences through the years that were sort of freaky. So there was this time where we were driving along in the car, myself and my daughters, and they were smaller. They were like elementary school age, and they were frustrated with their dad about something. And not my best parenting moment, but I said to them, well, look, you picked us. You picked him. And they said, and we had not really talked about reincarnation or any of that during those years. Those were my atheist years. But this popped out of my mouth because I did believe in reincarnation. And they said, we picked you. You picked him. And I was like, whoa, okay, okay. So some of these things would happen along the way where I was like, perhaps there's something else out there. And now I really firmly believe that there is more than, there's not one deity. I don't believe that. I do believe there's sort of this collective that helps guide us.
Yeah. And in the practice I receive, whenever I ask the question, because I have to include spirituality in everything that I do now, because it's such a big part of people's recovery journey. And so I'll say, who is your higher power / wise self / whomever the thing is or the person is that you identify with. And even on a weekly basis, my clients will give me different answers. Well, today it's this, or and next week it might be somebody else. And so I don't know that it really matters to me, as long as they have something, something that can give them support when they're not with me and when they're by themselves, So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
Talk about, how you were able to use your spirituality to recover and what that looked like.
Okay. So for me, it became a really important part of my recovery. So, and I don't, there's a couple of steps that talk about your higher power and how to identify that. And there was a worksheet I did at some point with my sponsor around, like, what were the lessons from my childhood around authority? Because the concept on that worksheet, just trying to remember it, it's been a couple of years, was we often internalize that as our higher power. So if you had a really critical father, mother, let's say, right? Or a teacher that was awful to you, or you were abused in some way, then sometimes you internalize that as a very critical higher power, not a supportive one. So this was really interesting to me as I began to explore it. And I have no idea how accurate that was or that is. I just know that that was what the worksheet was getting at, that this is how that belief develops. So once I began to identify my own as a very supportive one, because I did see the God of my childhood as critical, as very much judging, as, you know, just always like watching out for the bad things you're going to do, sort of like Santa, have you been naughty or nice, right? And that didn't sit well with me. So I began to develop this other concept of a loving, supportive higher power who happened to initially take a female form, which is interesting because I did not have the best mother, but somehow this was my good mom in my head, right? This female form. And my sponsor was female and I loved her. And so I think it became a sense of if I was struggling in my recovery, that became really important for me because it was a sense of, okay, perhaps you reach out to a couple of people and nobody picks up the phone, right? Or you do all of your list of soothing activities, although that'd be pretty hard to do all of them. But let's say you do a couple, right? Like things that are supposed to calm you down or stop you from binging or stopping this or whatever. You try those. Well, then asking for help from my higher power was really a way that I would help myself. So it'd be like, please help me here, please help me, or please take away these feelings, or please have somebody pick up the phone, or whatever that was. Right?
Yeah, I'm going to give this to you to hold on to.
Yes. Yeah. And the whole concept of turn it over, like, geez, when I first walked into recovery, I had no idea what that was. I was like, these people are nuts. How do you turn something over? Like, how exactly do you do that? And I see that in anxious clients too, even now, right? Like, they cannot let go of it. And I think it is harder if they don't have a sense of spirituality, a sense of, well, you can hand this over to your higher power or God, whatever you want to call that person.
Right.
And trust that things are going to get better, that there's some hope, that they're going to handle it, that they're going to have it for a little while. You don't have to carry it alone. So that did become really important to me in that process of turning it over and really being able to not worry about it at that point. So not just turning over, let's say, feelings I was struggling with or thoughts of relapse or whatever that is, but turning over all kinds of stuff. So I used to say my ex-husband used to be a big source of pain in my life, not so much anymore. But I would say, like, either take him or take these feelings away, right? Like, not a great prayer, okay? But you get what I mean. I think every woman has been divorced.
Every woman, I was going to say that,
Every person has been divorced will understand that, like, please, like, take these feelings away because they're so difficult. Or somehow remove him from my life, which I don't really want to happen because, he's good for my kids. But, it was that obviously the higher power was going to take the feelings away, right? Because he's still here, So.
Yes. And yeah, so we're glad that he's still here.
Yes, relatively. So it was that sense, though, of I had almost a mantra I could say in really hard times. And then that became easier and easier for me. And it became, instead of a cry for help at times, it really became more of a sense of comfort and on a daily basis, like when I do my gratefulness list, or when I'm walking the dog, like I was saying before, or just a sense of um, feeling like my life is wonderful and thank you so much, or manifesting. I get more into manifesting too in the last couple of years. I used to roll my eyes at The Secret as well and be like, you know,
Can you tell us what manifesting is?
I cannot.
Okay.
I can't give you a good explanation of manifesting. I have no idea. No one's ever asked me that. But I guess I would say, if I had to give it a shot, that it's a really bringing into reality your dreams and desires.
Okay.
That's what I would say. And so I was pretty good at that as an atheist too. Like ran a successful business and huge on goal setting, absolutely major goal setter, and breaking those down even, and keeping a like I would keep track of those and look back at them, because I knew even before I really read about manifesting, I felt like I was such a good goal setter, because it would always happen that I had to be careful about what I wrote down, even because it would come true. Not always the way I thought it would, but when I would look back, like let's say I wrote them at the beginning of the year, and I would look back a year or two later and I would be like, oh my God, I didn't remember writing that. And that one came true. Or I used to do what we call the dream journal, which is really like art. It's not dreams that you have at night. It's more art and collage and, uh, writing around your goals. Or you could say what you want to manifest, right? But manifesting to me has more of like the spiritual component to it. For some reason, it feels a little bit different than goal setting. And when I think about it that way, it's more like sometimes I'll just put these thoughts out to the world and that will happen. I don't know how it's going to happen, but it will happen. So it's less the dry breaking it down. Step 1, step 2, how are you going to get to that goal? And more like I don't know, naming the big thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's like how do you eat an elephant, like one step at a time.
Yes. And yes. And if it was like,
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, you could say, I'm going to eat an elephant this year, right? And then forget about it. And then find yourself 6 months later. Well, hopefully nobody eats an elephant, but we're just going with this metaphor. Find yourself 6 months later in the savannah having dinner, and they're serving elephant. And you're like, oh my God, I said I was going to eat an elephant, right? Versus like, I'm going to eat an elephant. Okay, well, where are you going to find the elephant? Well, maybe I can plan a trip to Africa, or India, right? Okay. And then what are you going to do? Well, then I'm going to find a restaurant who actually serves elephant. It's like breaking it down versus
Exactly.
I'm just going to write this down and let it go.
Exactly.
So I do both.
Okay.
I have my weekly list with everything broken down, but I definitely have those goals that I just sort of think about and let go, or write down and then let go.
Yeah. Yeah, good. So it definitely sounds like you have many pathways that you utilize when you're working on your recovery. It's not just looking at one spiritual being or deity. It's a combination of different things. And so I think that's really a point that I want to highlight. And then also, I'm wondering if you could find that worksheet. I think that might be helpful too.
Oh, yeah.
And I could link to it in the show notes.
I know I have it in my file somewhere.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. That'd be awesome.
Yeah, I'll send it to you. And I would say that recovery for me just opened me up more to spirituality. So these different methods, like I no longer had to roll my eyes. I could say, okay, let me look at that. That looks interesting. So
Yeah.
it's a sense of this process that was started there. And again, I don't know if it's always supported there. Like I don't do a really active recovery right now, meaning
Mhm.
I felt like that was a chunk of my life and I got what I needed and then I moved on. So I'll attend a meeting here and there, but it's not like a regular, I used to go 2 or 3 times a week, right? And then phone meetings and 90 and 90 and several different programs. And, that's a very active recovery in terms of 12
Right.
step. So I still work on it in different ways, but I would say outside of the 12-step model. So the 12-step model, I think, was a jumping off point for me. But eventually I became just open to how a sense of spirituality is good for my life. And then I feel like I've internalized that and that I'll carry with me the rest of my life. I may forget I will never forget what step 4 is, but I may forget step 7 or something. I don't know. you know? But the sense of spirituality, something you can take with you.
Yes. Yeah, I completely agree. Well, I think that's probably a good place to stop. I really appreciate you coming on and for all of the wisdom that you shared with us today. What are some of the best ways to find you and all the awesome work that you're
Yes.
doing?
Well, first I want to say it was my pleasure. I think it's a really interesting podcast. From the beginning, when I heard the idea, I was like, that's a great idea. So thank you for having me on. And people can find me through my website, drlizhypnosis.com. That's DRLIZ hypnosis.com. And I do work all over the world because we can these days through phone or Zoom or Skype. They can listen to my podcast, Hypnotize Me, and they can find that on any podcast player. It's going on. We're in the middle of the 3rd year now. We're almost done with the 3rd year. There's no we, it's me, but I feel like it's a we because it's my listeners and the people I interview, and I guess it is a we, right? And it will include my higher powers with a plural there on the end. So we're going on our 3rd year now, and I really love it. So that's a great way to get to know me as well.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening to the Atheists in Recovery podcast. For more great info and to stay up to date, head over to atheistsandrecovery.com.